Hi, I'm Dr. Lee Whittinghill, Assistant Professor of Urban Agriculture at Kentucky State University. I'm going to be talking about some lessons we've learned from relay cropping greens in small-scale agriculture, both at the research farm here at Kentucky State University and 2 participant farmer sites. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the term relay cropping, it's growing more than one crop over the course of a season, often with some overlap in when the crops are in the field. If there is overlap in when the crops are in the field, it can also be considered intercropping. If not, for example, we typically harvest one crop, remove it from the field, and plant the second crop, then that is more of a form of succession planting. So the seeds may be sown before the harvest of the first crop, and this is often done with cover crops in field agriculture. We're using it on a much smaller scale, growing more than one crop at different times. So the second crop in our system is planted immediately following the harvest of the first crop. And this is frequently used in growing greens and growing a number of other crops to maximize production during the growing season, especially for market farms, community-supported agriculture, and for other consumers that rely on consistent yields throughout the season. Here I have an example of a mixed vegetable beds. You can see the different crops may be planted in the summer, followed by the one in the fall. So how many crops you can get in will depend on how long each crop takes and when they can be started and how late they can be started in the growing season so that they can be harvested before the first frost. This is one reason that greens are optimal, because they have a relatively short growing time. This type of technique is often used in intensive farming practices, including small plot intensive farming. This type of intensive farming relies on 3 main concepts: using raised beds or container plots, which helps to manage water in the soil. It also helps to manage weeds. I use fast maturing crops between 20 and 30 days, which can get you, in most cases, a leaf or baby stage green. And they also recommend high value crops that have proven to be profitable in your area. Often this includes greens. Greens are also shallow rooted, which makes them ideal for relay cropping in containers and raised bed production systems. We also are growing them in a shallow green roof system, so having shallow roots is ideal for that as well. Our original plant selection included 7 types of greens to be planted over the course of a growing season, starting with lettuce after the first or the last frost in the spring has passed. It included arugula, mizuna, which is an Asian mustard green, red giant mustard greens, a Swiss chard, which was added in 2019, red Russian kale, and Corvair spinach. When we started the project in 2018, we started a little bit late, so we started with arugula here on the research farm and mustard greens at our 1 participant site that year. We added Swiss chard to the August part of the growing season because it is typically a bit more heat tolerant than the other greens, and we saw problems in 2018 because of the heat during that time. We have several different growing systems that we're looking at. You can see here our raised beds at our participant farm in Berea and our participant farm here in a Frankfurt backyard. Here at the research farm, we have containers, which are made of kiddie pools. These are inexpensive and readily available in many urban areas, so a good option to keep costs down. And raised beds filled with both topsoil and green roof media. This shows our complete planting and harvesting calendar for 2018 and 2019. So you can see that we got a little bit of a late start in 2018 because of when beds were installed. You can also see where Swiss chard was added in 2019. We did not get to spinach in 2019, partially because of the drought, and I'll talk about that a little bit in more detail. So we were able to get quite a bit of information on our research farm. Not only were we measuring yield, but we also measured how much time it took to harvest and used that to look at budgeting for the different systems and how profitable they might be for small-scale farmers. Or another way of looking at that is how quickly you pay off the costs of installation of your system. This data here is from 2019, when we had 2 participant farming sites, and is a comparison of yields from those 2 farming sites and the comparable system in the KSU research beds. For some of our greens, we saw higher yields at the Berea site. So my letters here across the lettuce graph indicate differences between the groups. So A is different from the 2 B sites. You may also notice that I have yields listed in grams per meter squared. That's because our different sites had different sized beds, so I normalized for area to make them more compatible for comparison. Once I did that, we saw that our Frankfort backyard site had comparable yields in most cases to the Kentucky Research Farm. The Berea site is a more experienced group than the Frankfort participant farmers, and potentially even than some of the KSU research team. They also are more full-time farmers rather than having other responsibilities. So I believe they were able to devote a little bit more care to their plots than the Frankfort site. So they saw higher yields, and in some cases, less of an effect of some of the negative things that we saw. Arugula was similar across all sites. One of the reasons for this is that once we planted arugula in, I want to say it was end of May, we started to see flea beetles in the plots, and those were seen in the Frankfort site, at the Berea site, and the KSU research farm. The Berea site did take several measures to try and combat the flea beetle damage, although they were not successful, but they may have been a little bit more successful than the Frankfort or KSU site. The Frankfort site had very minimal pest control, if any at all. Looking at our greens, again, we see much higher yields at the experienced farm site than the Frankfort site. You may also note that the KSU yields of Mizuna were extremely low. We essentially had a failed harvest in 2019, so got almost nothing from the plots. All right, so one thing I want to mention is the drought in 2019. You can see in the orange box the September precipitation information. The gray bar is the total precipitation for 2018. The white bar is total precipitation for 2019. And then the black bar is what we call a climatic normal. So the average amount of precipitation we would expect to see in September based on a 30-year average. So you can see that 2018 was relatively wet compared to the climatic average throughout the growing season, but 2019, starting in July, was below the climatic normal, and September we had almost no measurable rain. So that decrease in rain, even though we were irrigating, did affect yields at the KSU research farm and heavily affected yields at the Frankfort site, where irrigation may have been less regular. One thing to mention about the KSU raised beds is that ours are elevated, so they tend to dry out a little bit more than raised beds at ground level might. Swiss chard was the crop that was planted during the drought or was growing during the drought. So its harvest was much longer than expected. It took more days to grow out, and we had a lower harvest. It was also slightly delayed compared to our initial plan because the mustard took longer than expected as well. You'll notice that the Frankfurt site is missing from both the Swiss chard and kale grafts. That's because their Swiss chard took so long, they were unable to plant kale and did not get chard at a measurable size or a harvestable size that year. We do, however, have 2 years worth of data for the Frankfurt site and the KSU site for Mizuna, mustard greens, and kale. And I was hoping to see some improvement in yields in the Frankfurt site from 1 year to the next as the farmers got more experienced. We did see a little bit of improvement in the Mizuna, which you can see here, 2018 and 2019. They were not significantly different from each other, but I believe that is because of the variability of the Mizuna yield in 2019. You'll notice again that the Mizuna harvest at KSU was almost nothing in 2019. Mustard greens, we did not see an improvement from the first year to the next. They were a relatively, both years the mustard greens experienced flea beetle damage, more in 2019 than 2018. And that may have counterbalanced the improved practices in 2019. All right. Because of the delay in 2018, we also had slightly different temperature patterns during those two times. So Mizuna was planted in August in 2018 and July in 2019. So the slightly lower temperatures in 2019 benefited Mizuna at the KSU farm in some of our plots. And the mustard was planted in early August in 2019 and late August in 2018. Again, the difference in temperature between those two times may have impacted yield, both the ability of the mustard seed to germinate and then how well it grew after germination. In this case, though, 2019 was a little bit warmer early August than 2018 was in late August. Our kale harvest at the Frankfurt site was a little bit lower than we would have liked to have seen in 2018, but comparable to the KSU harvest. And again, they were unable to plant their kale in 2019 because of delays. But looking at the difference in 2018 and 2019 on the KSU farm, moving the kale to October from September reduced temperatures, which made it more favorable growing environment for the kale. Right. So I mentioned significant flea beetle damage. This was seen in the arugula, Mizuna, and mustard in 2019 in all sites. And some attempts were made to combat the flea beetle damage, but we were unsuccessful. The planting calendar also does not mesh well with a CSA or other sales calendar, where you might want to have lettuce throughout the growing season, or lettuce and kale and spinach throughout the growing season. And we did notice that, as I mentioned, the setbacks did not affect the experienced farm as much as the beginning farm group. So we set about to make some changes in 2020. One of the changes was going to be row covers to protect from insect damage. Because of the COVID-19 shutdown, implementation of row covers and, in fact, planting was delayed significantly in 2020. So we didn't actually plant until May which is around the time we started to see flea beetle damage in 2019. So we were too late to implement our row covers, but luckily we did not see flea beetle damage at all on the KSU site in 2020. I'm a little bit unsure why this is, but I will be looking into it. Part of it may be that we were planting only lettuce, and the flea beetles aren't as interested in our lettuce varieties as they were in the Mizuna, although I would expect that actually to be opposite based on the spicy nature of most mustards. We were also going to implement cut and come again harvesting. So this is, you remove the oldest outside leaves, leaving the growing center. In the case of lettuce, you can cut off the entire top of the plant about 1 inch above the surface of the soil, leaving the growing center in place to keep growing. Vegetables with leaves growing in a rosette form are the best choice for this type of harvesting, so most of the greens that we had selected for relay cropping. Other good vegetables include onions, scallions, fennel, and broccoli. So in the case of broccoli, you can cut off the big head and leave smaller secondary heads to keep growing. One thing we did notice, so I said you cut off lettuce about 1 inch above the soil. That works for the first harvest, but as you can see in this picture here, the lettuces did start to grow taller, or at least some of them did, grow taller after each cutting. So we had to adjust our cutting height to ensure that we didn't cut off the growing head. So at KSU, we adjusted our plan so that we were only planting and harvesting lettuce. And we actually ended up switching lettuce varieties from the Encore lettuce. But here's some information about this type of practice with lettuce. The seeding rate I obtained from information from a practicing farm. The days to maturity for the leaf stage is about 28. And then additional harvests can be cut every 7 to 14 days, depending on the climate. And you can get up to 4 harvests per planting before you have to replant. My thought process with this was that if we already have an established root system, when we're moving into those hotter periods, when the plants are going to be more stressed, they'll grow back more easily than they would if we were planting them from seed. And a potential yield of 3.1 kilograms per meter squared. I have to see still if we were able to achieve that high yield in our lettuce at any point in time. I suspect, though, that we were, especially early in the growing season. So another change that we made was to stagger planting. And this was done at our participating farm in Frankfurt as well as at the KSU research farm. We divided up into 4 beds for planting, staggering so that harvests would take place every week. This is the type of calendar you would want if you were providing for a CSA share, regular farmers market stalls, or weekly to restaurants or other consumers. This calendar looks at replanting every 2 weeks. And this one, no. I thought this was the one that had, I established 2 calendars. One for if the second harvest would take place 14 days after the first, and one for if the second and subsequent harvest would take place 7 days after the first. You will notice, though, that there is a little bit of overlap for the 4th bed, but without that 4th bed, there were a few dates, July 2nd and September 10th, that would not have had a harvest. So if you really need a harvest every week, that 4th bed was important, especially for lettuce. That changes a little bit for the different greens because some of the other greens have a slightly longer period from planting to the first harvest. So our Frankfurt site, we broke it up. They have 4 by 8 foot raised beds, and to enable those harvests. So for lettuce and spinach, 4 harvests or 4 beds were necessary to cover the whole week. For kale and mustard, only 3 beds were necessary to ensure a harvest every week. The Swiss chard was something we wanted to try, and I believe would need 3 beds as well to get a harvest every week. At the KSU Research Farm, we broke things up a little bit differently. One, because we're trying to get some data about the practice of cut and come again and staggered planting. So we divided each of our plots into 4 quarters, which would look something like this in our square raised beds, and like this in our container. You can see the lettuces are a little bit bigger in the closer quarter and a little bit smaller in the far quarters in this bed. They were planted later. We randomized which quarter would get planted first as part of our research study. Randomization is an important practice in scientific research, and planted throughout the growing season using a calendar similar to that one that I showed you. We're also looking at different nutrient management treatments, a conventional fertilizer, an organic fertilizer, high levels of compost, and low levels of compost plus an organic fertilizer. In our green roof systems, we are looking at different levels of compost addition with organic fertilizer. So we had a couple of questions we wanted to address. Does it take 14 days between cuts in the spring and fall, and only 7 days between cuts in the summer, as suggested by some practicing farmers? And if so, when does that transition take place? In order to have an accurate planting and harvesting calendar to ensure yields for CSA or restaurant production, this information could be important. Can we actually get 4 harvests from 1 planting? And does the cost of labor outweigh the sales from harvests at the 3rd or 4th harvest? And is there a difference in that between the spring and fall and the summer? And then what is the window of time in the summer that it's not profitable to grow the greens anymore? So most people don't consider growing things like lettuce and kale in August and July because it is so hot, although many people producing for CSAs do. So I wanted to get some solid information about what that looks like in this part of Kentucky. So we've made a few observations so far. We have a lot of data from this year, including yields and how much time it takes to harvest each plot or each quarter of a plot. We also have taken meticulous notes about how many days were taking place between cuttings and when we replanted. So how many cuttings we were able to get out of a planting in the different systems and how many days between each. So we noticed that very high yields early in the season. Moving from July to August, or by the end of July, we had harvested 500 pounds of lettuce. I haven't done the complete math, but I doubt we've harvested 250 since then. So we saw lower yields in the second planting than we did in that early planting. And that was the August and September harvests. The harvests were smaller. We had less regrowth between harvests, but we did see some new germination in September without replanting. So that suggests to me that some of the seed that we planted during that hot period of time didn't germinate because the conditions weren't right and started to germinate in September when temperatures cooled down. But you can see here the difference between a similar plot early in the season, so I believe this picture was taken in June, and one in August. We were, however, able to achieve 3 or 4 harvests on most plots, especially in that early part of the season. And we were able to achieve 3 or 4 harvests on some plots later in the season, but not as many plots. And I have to do some analysis to figure out if those plots that we got more harvests from were in a particular treatment. So this picture here shows what I mean by less regrowth between harvests. You can kind of see this part here is where it was cut and is not regrowing. here it's regrowing, and here there's a red lettuce regrowing. So I noticed that much more in the second half of the growing season than the first half. We also had some interesting observations about our high compost treatment. It took longer to reach maturity, took longer between harvests, and achieved fewer harvests between plantings than many of our other plots. So you can see here these two plots. The top one here is one of our fertilizer-only treatments, and the bottom one is the compost-only or high compost treatment. They were planted at the same time. And there's a noticeable difference in their level of maturity on this day. One of the things that I've learned recently from a conference is that compost high in manure tends to be better at being an amendment for soil rather than a nutrient source for plants when it's high in manure. Compost based predominantly on kitchen scraps and other plant material tends to be a better nutrient source for plants than soil amendment. And in this study that I heard about at the conference, they were growing spinach and kale and saw the same thing we did here, in that the high compost treatment of theirs from the manure-heavy compost had delayed growth. So we're hoping to learn a little bit from this and have some more information, maybe updates come February for the differences in our treatments. And I'll be working with our Frankfurt site to get some information about how their growing season went this year. Normally, the KSU team is very heavily involved in that, but with COVID-19, we've had to leave that up to the beginning farmers themselves. So this could be a really interesting look at how we transition them from having our help to being independent and self-sufficient. If you have any questions about relay cropping, cut and chemagan, green roofs, or growing greens, I can be reached at lee.whittinghill@kysu.edu.